A heat haze hangs over Riverbend as the crowd gathers, laughing at the sign that reads, "Three dogs, $10." Three German Shepherd pups stand in the dust with burlap sacks tied over their heads, rope tight at their ribs. He was only passing through, a Marine who swore he would never rescue again. But when the smallest pup turns toward him through the cloth, as if whispering his name, the noise of the market disappears. No one sees his hands start to shake. No one believes he will step forward. Yet, he remembers a promise, and he remembers what it means to be saved. What happens next will make you cry and believe in second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments, and if you believe no human or animal should be left behind, hit subscribe, because this story might just restore your faith in miracles. The morning in Riverbend was heavy with humidity, the kind of damp that clung to the skin and never quite let go. Clouds pressed low above the levees, streaked with brown where the river had spat mud into the air during the last storm. The air smelled of wet earth, pine sap, and the faint tang of smoke from chimneys still burning kindling, even though the spring was already edging into summer. Riverbend, a small Louisiana town caught between the endless curve of the river and a sprawl of half-drowned farmland, had always been a place where routine meant survival. It was market day, and the square was alive with chatter, clattering wagon wheels, and the cries of merchants who knew half the customers by name and the other half by reputation. Ethan Ward walked down Main Street with his shoulders squared and his steps even, as though he were still marching a patrol rather than drifting through a town he once called home. He was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean muscle of a man who had spent most of his adult life in uniform. His face was weather-browned, his square jaw dusted with a day's stubble, and a faint scar ran along his left forearm, the kind that came not from barbed wire or a farm accident but from shrapnel. His hair, close-cropped and dark brown, with the barest hint of gray at the temples, carried the mark of discipline he had not yet shed. His gray-green eyes, however, were different. They carried something the military had left behind. An emptiness mixed with vigilance, the watchfulness of someone who had lost more than he could name. Ethan was a man who spoke little, not out of coldness, but because words had failed him once. On a battlefield where even a command shouted at the top of his lungs couldn't stop what was coming. The townsfolk knew him only by fragments. To some, he was the ward boy come back from the Marines. To others, he was the quiet widower with no children, though the truth was simpler and sadder. He had never married, and his only family had died years before. He came to the market once a week, bought flour, beans, lamp oil, and left before gossip could tie itself around his ankles. Today he hadn't meant to stop at all, but the market square had a way of catching people, and the sound he heard, a crowd gathered, voices rising with that peculiar sharpness reserved for spectacle, drew him against his better judgment. At the center of the square, beside a leaning post meant for announcements and notices, three small figures stood in the dirt. At first glance, Ethan thought they were children, the way their heads were covered in rough burlap sacks that sagged around their shoulders. But then he saw the legs, the way they trembled, the way their paws shifted against the ropes binding them. They were dogs, German Shepherd pups, perhaps 6 to 8 months old, though it was hard to tell with the sacks tied tight and the ropes digging into their ribs. A crude hand-painted sign leaned against the post. 3 dogs, $10 the lot. No questions. The auctioneer was a man named Gerald Pike, though most called him Red Pike for the constant sunburn that had settled permanently into his face. Gerald was thick around the waist, with suspenders stretched too tight over a sweat-stained shirt. His hair was thinning at the crown, and he had the wary look of someone who always expected to be challenged but rarely had the strength to fight back. He scratched his neck with a stubby hand and called out, $10 takes the lot. Shepherd pups. Good for work if you can tame them. Don't ask about where they came from, just ask about what they can do for you. His voice carried the whine of a salesman who knew his goods weren't worth the price but hoped someone desperate might bite. Gerald wasn't cruel by design, but he wasn't compassionate either. A man shaped by years of small debts and smaller victories, he had learned to see every living thing as either a burden or a bargain. The crowd gathered tight, as people did when cruelty was on display, but guilt was still far enough away to ignore. Mrs. Agnes Turner, a widow with a hawk nose and sharp tongue, leaned on her cane and muttered, "Mean little beasts, those. Heard they bit the last man clean through the hand." Beside her, a farmer named Clyde Dillard, tall and stoop-shouldered from years of bending over rice fields, spat into the dirt and said, "3 devils, that's what they are. Ain't nobody keeping 'em long." They spoke as though the pups were cursed objects, not flesh and bone. A few younger men laughed, nudging each other, betting how long it would take before someone foolish enough bought them and regretted it. Ethan stood a few steps back, but his eyes were fixed on the dogs. His breath caught, and for a moment the noise of the market blurred into memory. He was no longer in Riverbend, but in a desert half a world away, dust storm blowing, his canine partner, Atlas, a sable-coated shepherd, running beside him. Atlas had saved his life once, pulling him clear of an improvised mine with a tug so fierce it tore his arm. Atlas had died later, silent and fast, in a blast that had left Ethan picking sand out of his skin for weeks. He had buried the dog with his own hands in foreign soil. Now, staring at these pups trussed up like criminals, Ethan felt the same ache in his chest. He whispered under his breath, words only he could hear, "Not again. Not like this." Gerald Pike's patience was running thin. He bent, seized one of the pups by the rope, and jerked it forward. The animal staggered, the sack twisting so its legs splayed clumsily. The crowd chuckled, cruel and careless. "See? Can't even stand straight," Gerald called, but his voice cracked with unease. The tallest pup, likely Axel though Ethan did not yet know the name he would give him, weighed and caught himself, standing stiff despite the sack. Another pup, the middle one, Rex, shifted nervously, whimpering low. The smallest, Milo, didn't move at all. He simply trembled, then stilled, as though stillness itself might make him invisible. $10, Gerald barked. 3 fine beasts. Don't eat much. Don't make noise. You could train 'em for guard dogs or... His words trailed, because even he didn't believe them. When no one stepped forward, he huffed and pushed again, this time shoving the smallest pup with the toe of his boot. The pup cried out, a muffled sound from inside the sack, and the crowd laughed again. That was when Ethan moved. He stepped through the ring of onlookers with a calmness that was more threatening than any outburst. His boot struck the dirt hard, like punctuation. People drew back without meaning to. Gerald squinted up, uneasy. "You here for one, Ward?" he asked, his tone edging between hope and fear. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket and drew out a worn leather wallet. Inside were a few folded bills and coins, the sum total of his week's allowance. Without hesitation, he pulled out a $10 note, edges frayed from too many hands, and pressed it into Gerald's palm. "All 3, Ethan said. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. The crowd stilled. Mrs. Turner's cane froze mid-tap. Clyde's spit dried on the ground. Gerald blinked, confused. "All 3? He repeated, as though he hadn't heard right. "That's the lot. No returns." Ethan's gray-green eyes narrowed. "Untie them." Gerald shifted from one foot to the other, sweat glistening at his temples. "You don't know what you're buying, Ward. They ain't trained. They don't bark, don't cry, haven't eaten since sunrise. Seller said keep the sacks on. Could be mute, could be worse." He chuckled weakly, but the sound died quick. Ethan didn't blink. "Untie them." The command in his tone was sharper than any blade. Slowly, grumbling, Gerald drew a pocket knife and cut the ropes one by one. The sacks fell. The first pup lifted his head, revealing pale blue eyes too large for his gaunt face. His jaw tightened, but he stood unflinching. The second pup showed a bruise under one eye and a scab on his lip, his gaze darting between faces but never settling. The smallest pup blinked against the light, then stared straight at Ethan. For a moment, the market square was silent. Then, in a voice not loud, not fearful, just certain, the pup gave a sound like a whisper, a single whine that was almost a word. Ethan's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He only stepped closer, one hand reaching out as though to steady them. "Come with me," he said simply. And the market for once had no reply. The crowd in Riverbend Square broke apart slowly, whispers chasing Ethan as he led the 3 young shepherds toward the edge of the market. Some shook their heads, muttering about wasted money. Others eyed him with a strange mix of pity and curiosity. He ignored them all. His boots beat a steady rhythm against the damp boards of the walkway, and the 3 dogs stumbled along beside him, still bewildered by the sudden light after the stifling sacks had been cut away. Axel, the eldest and strongest, stood nearly 20 inches at the shoulder already, his legs too long for his narrow frame. His coat was sable with dark ridges, though patches of fur were thin where rope had rubbed him raw. His pale blue eyes were unusual for a shepherd, clear as river ice, and they gave him a haunted, almost human look. He walked stiffly, as though daring the world to test his strength, and though he swayed from hunger, he did not fall. Rex, the middle pup, was leaner, with a black saddle marking that curved down his back and a white scar across his muzzle, the kind that could only come from a chain biting into tender skin. His ears twitched constantly, and his brown eyes darted from face to face, never resting, as if each passerby might raise a hand against him. When someone coughed in the crowd, he crouched so low his belly nearly touched the ground, a reflex learned from too many blows. Milo, the smallest, was barely 6 months old. His fur was a soft tan with darker streaks on his ears, though now it was dulled by grime. His ribs showed sharply, and his legs trembled as he tried to keep pace with his brothers. Yet his eyes, large, dark, and unblinking, were fixed on Ethan. Where Axel bore defiance and Rex carried suspicion, Milo radiated something different, a fragile trust, the kind that could shatter with a harsh word, but, if nurtured, might grow into fierce loyalty. As they reached the edge of the square, Ethan stopped beside his old Jeep. The vehicle was as battered as he was, a 1970s CJ model with peeling paint the color of moss, a windshield cracked along one corner, and tires coated in mud from the levee roads. It had once belonged to his father, who had driven it to fish the bayous before his health failed. Now it was Ethan's only companion in long drives between the levee and town. "Up you go," Ethan murmured, lowering the tailgate. Axel hesitated, but jumped first, claws scraping the metal. Rex followed slower, scanning the street as if expecting a trap. Milo tried, failed, and whined softly. Ethan sighed, lifted the pup gently, and set him down with the others. For a moment, Milo pressed his thin body against Ethan's chest, and the Marine felt the faintest vibration of a whine that seemed to form into something close to his name. As Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, he caught sight of a figure standing by the well across the road. Sarah Calloway, a tall woman in her late 40s, was the town's seamstress. She had a long, narrow face framed by iron-gray hair pinned into a bun that had not loosened once in 20 years of work. Her back was perpetually straight, a habit born from years of bending over sewing tables and forcing herself upright again. Sarah had raised 3 children alone after her husband drowned during a flood 10 years prior. The tragedy had hardened her, but it had also carved out a quiet compassion beneath the surface, the kind she only showed in rare moments. She caught Ethan's eye, nodded once in acknowledgement, then glanced at the pups in the Jeep bed. "They'll break you if you're not careful," she called in a voice as sharp as scissors snipping thread. "But if anyone can mend broken things, it might be you." Then she turned, her long skirt swishing, and disappeared back into the crowd. The road out of town was muddy from the week's storms, ruts deep enough to jolt the Jeep at every turn. Cypress knees poked out of the waterlogged ditches, and the air buzzed with cicadas even though the clouds hung low. Ethan drove in silence, glancing now and then into the rearview mirror. Axel lay stiff, paws crossed, eyes fixed on the passing trees. Rex crouched low, ears twitching with every splash of water against the tires. Milo had his head propped against the side of the Jeep bed, watching Ethan through the rear window as though memorizing the shape of his face. Halfway home, the road dipped near the levee where floodwater had pooled. Ethan slowed, the Jeep splashing through, water licking at the hubcaps. The dog stirred uneasily. Milo whimpered once, then pressed his paw against the window. Without thinking, Ethan reached back, palm brushing the pup's paw through the glass. Milo's eyes glistened, and he licked the spot his paw touched as if sealing a silent vow. The gesture struck Ethan harder than he expected. His throat tightened, and for a moment he was back in the desert again, crouched beside Atlas after the blast, whispering through sand-choked air, "Don't leave me, not yet." He had begged then for someone, anyone, to need him again, to call his name in a way that made the world bearable. Milo's gaze was the answer to that prayer, though Ethan wasn't sure if he could carry the weight of it. The Jeep crested the final rise, and the ward cabin came into view. It was a squat wooden house perched on the edge of the valley, where pine trees rose tall, and the creek carved its way through thick underbrush. The paint was long gone, the windows clouded with dust, and the barn leaned to one side as though tired of standing. But it was shelter, and more importantly, it was his. Ethan parked beside the porch, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the hush that followed. The pup stirred restlessly until he opened the tailgate. Axel leapt down first, paws steady despite his gauntness. Rex sniffed the ground nervously before following. Milo hesitated, staring up at Ethan as though waiting for permission. Ethan crouched, extending his hand. "Come on, little one," he said quietly. Milo stepped forward, licked his hand once, and then jumped down. As they stood together in the yard, the wind shifted, the pines whispered, and a crow called from the distance. Ethan looked at the 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him, one defiant, one wary, one hopeful. Something stirred deep inside him, a weight he hadn't realized he still carried. He had thought he was done being responsible for lives after the war had taken too many, but here they were, fragile and fierce, waiting for him. Milo pressed against his leg, his tongue brushing Ethan's hand again, the dark eyes shimmering with a trust that seemed too pure for this world. Ethan swallowed hard. It was not just affection, it was a call, a plea, a claim. You are the one. You are the answer. Ethan remembered the night he had knelt beside Atlas's grave and whispered into the dirt, "Let someone need me again. Let someone say my name." Now, on this damp Louisiana evening, he realized the prayer had been answered. Not by a man or woman, not by comrades, but by 3 battered creatures the world had cast aside. He looked down at Milo, then at Axel and Rex, and for the first time in years, his voice shook as he spoke. "You're mine now, all of you, and I'll be yours." The market's laughter, the gossip of townsfolk, the years of silence, none of it mattered. What mattered was the feel of a small tongue on his hand, and the certainty in 3 pairs of eyes that he was no longer alone. The Ward cabin sat at the edge of Riverbend's valley, where the pine trees pressed close against the levee and the creek ran quick with muddy water. The cabin had been built by Ethan's grandfather nearly 70 years ago, and though time had worn grooves into its wooden bones, it still stood. The paint had long peeled into pale strips. The roof sagged in the middle where storms had hammered it, and the front porch leaned like a tired soldier who refused to sit down. Behind the house, an old chicken coop lay abandoned, its wire bent, its posts crooked, and the yard that once grew vegetables now lay under patches of mud and weeds. Yet despite the decay, the place bore the unmistakable shape of refuge, the kind of home that could endure if only someone cared enough to hold it together. Ethan parked the Jeep beside the porch, cut the engine, and listened. The air was still, broken only by the cry of a whip-poor Will and the creak of the levee gates in the distance. The dogs scrambled out of the back one by one. Axel jumped first, landing with a thud, muscles taut though his frame was thin. His pale blue eyes scanned the yard like a sentry checking for threats, a habit etched into him from months of fear. Rex crept down slower, his scarred muzzle sniffing the mud, ears pricked at every sound, the flap of the coop door in the breeze, the groan of the barn beams. Milo hung back until Ethan offered his arms again, then leapt down softly, pressing once more against his leg as if to remind him, "I am yours." Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Ethan lit a lamp, its glow spilling across walls that bore scratches of old years, some carved initials, some marks of furniture long since gone. The hearth still held warmth from the morning fire, and beside it stood a cupboard stacked with jars of dried beans, cornmeal, and flour. Ethan set a battered tin bowl on the floor and filled it with scraps left from his last meal. Cornbread crumbled into milk, bits of dried venison from a jar. The dogs fell upon it ravenous. Axel ate fast but kept one eye on Ethan. Rex pulled back at every clink of the spoon as if expecting punishment, and Milo carefully nudged his brothers aside, only when their bellies slowed. When they had finished, Ethan pulled 3 folded wool blankets from a chest at the foot of the stairs. They were old military issue, gray and coarse, but they carried the smell of cedar from years stored in the trunk. He spread them in front of the fireplace, one beside the other, then stepped back. Axel circled once before collapsing in a protective curl. Rex lay stiff, paws tucked tight beneath him, ears twitching. Milo crawled immediately against Ethan's boot, sighing a soft whine that trembled into silence. Ethan crouched, rubbing the pup's head gently, and spoke aloud to himself more than to them. "Not much, but it's what I have. It's safe here, safer than anywhere else." He looked around the cabin with a soldier's eye for imperfection. A shutter hung loose on the far wall. The barn sagged as though it might fall before summer. The fields were overrun, and the coop reeked faintly of fox. He had not bothered with such things when he returned to Riverbend alone. He had needed little more than a roof, a bed, and silence. But now, standing with 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him, he saw the house differently. It's not beautiful, he thought, but maybe it can be enough. Later, as dusk turned to night, Ethan stepped outside to fetch wood. His neighbor from across the valley, Mr. Hollis Dunn, was walking the fence line with a lantern. Hollis was a wiry man in his 60s, his back bent like the scythes he carried, and his hair silver white beneath a broad hat. He raised his lantern when he saw Ethan. "Ward," he called, his voice carrying over the creek. "Heard you brought something home from market." His tone was not accusing, only curious, the kind of voice a man used when he had seen too many strange things to be surprised anymore. "They're just pups," Ethan replied, hefting an armful of wood. Hollis squinted across the distance. "Pups with sacks on their heads and rope around their legs? Don't sound like just pups to me. You watch yourself. Folks say they bite." Then he lowered the lantern, offered a brief nod, and continued down the fence line, muttering to himself as he always did. Hollis was not a cruel man, but years of losing cattle to storms and fields to floods had left him wary of anything new. Back inside, Ethan stoked the fire until the flames licked high. The dog stirred restlessly, unused to the quiet. Axel's ears twitched. He gave a low growl at the shifting shadows on the wall. Rex tucked himself tighter, his scarred muzzle hidden beneath a paw. Milo whimpered, pushing closer until his tiny body trembled against Ethan's leg. Ethan sat in the wooden chair by the hearth, watching them. The crack of fire, the soft hiss of embers, and the distant groan of frogs outside filled the silence. Then it came, the sound that broke the fragile calm. Axel snapped his head toward the door and growled deep in his chest, a low rumble that spoke of warning, not fear. Rex flattened himself against the blanket, whimpering. Milo whimpered louder, a high, thin sound that trembled like a broken string. Ethan rose slowly, every muscle taut, and laid his hand on Axel's head. "Easy," he whispered. He walked to the door, cracked it open, and found nothing but the night, thick and heavy, the pines shifting under the breeze. He closed the door, bolted it, and turned back. The 3 dogs had not moved. Their eyes gleamed in the firelight, reflecting something older than their months, something carved into them by cruelty he had not yet seen. He crouched by the blankets, his hand resting on Milo's trembling back. He looked at Axel, whose growl still vibrated, at Rex, whose eyes flicked nervously, at Milo, whose soft cry tugged at his chest. "They've been through hell," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "And now it's my turn to stand for them." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the levee gates groaned again, but inside the cabin a different kind of vow was forged, not in ceremony, not in words carved into stone, but in the quiet decision of one man to protect what no one else would. Morning light in Riverbend carried a damp heaviness, filtered through gray clouds swollen with the promise of more rain. The Ward cabin creaked as the wind pressed against it, pine needles scratching the roof like ghostly fingers. Ethan rose early, as he always did, though sleep had been shallow. He stripped down to wash in the basin near the back porch, filling it with cold creek water he had carried in a pail the night before. The shock of the chill pulled a sharp breath from his chest, but he endured, splashing it across his face and shoulders. As he lifted his shirt away, his body told its own story. Scars from shrapnel, pale lines crisscrossing his torso, and an ugly gouge along his rib cage where a bullet had once torn through. His left forearm bore a long raised scar that tugged whenever he flexed his hand. Ethan had grown accustomed to these reminders of war, but standing in the morning light, he traced them with a grim recognition. He reached for a tin of salve, homemade by an old midwife in town, thick with pine resin and beeswax. With slow patience, he rubbed the ointment across each scar. It was not for healing, they had long since healed, but for ritual, a way to remind himself that though he was broken in places, he still endured. From the yard came a bark, sharp and commanding. Axel was awake, already patrolling the chicken coop that leaned precariously near the fence line. The sable-coated pup moved like a soldier on duty, circling the coop with stiff-legged purpose, blue eyes locked on the empty wire, as though expecting an enemy to appear. Rex, however, slunk under the porch steps, ears pinned back at the distant rumble of thunder. He hated storms. The sound made him flinch violently, as if every clap of thunder were a whip crack. Milo, as always, had followed Ethan. The small pup sat at his heel, head cocked upward, eyes wide with something like devotion. He refused to leave Ethan's side even for a moment, as if distance itself might cause abandonment. Ethan dressed, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The mud squelched under his weight, and Axel bounded over, tail stiff, eyes burning with energy. "You're too young for a guard," Ethan muttered, but there was no hiding the hint of pride in his voice. He whistled low, a sharp sound drilled into him from years of canine work, and Axel froze, ears snapping forward. Rex peeked from under the porch. Milo wagged his tail cautiously, unsure. "Sit," Ethan said firmly. His voice carried the clipped cadence of command. Axel obeyed at once, dropping into a stiff sit. Rex hesitated, then sank slowly, eyes darting toward the sky. Milo plopped down clumsily, his hind legs sprawling as though his body hadn't yet learned its own mechanics. Ethan crouched and praised them with a scratch behind each ear, his tone softening. "Good, we'll get there." He spent the morning running them through basics: sit, stay, come, heel, his commands firm but never harsh. Axel caught on, quickly, sharp, and eager to please. Rex obeyed only after hesitation, flinching at sudden movements. Milo, though clumsy, never took his eyes off Ethan, his focus pure and unwavering. Training them stirred something dormant in Ethan's chest. For the first time since Atlas, he felt the familiar rhythm of a bond forming, the unspoken dialogue between man and dog. By midday, the sky darkened, and rain came in a steady sheet. Ethan built a small fire inside, drying his boots by the hearth. The dogs huddled near, Axel closest to the door. Rex pressed into the corner with every thunderclap, and Milo curled tight against Ethan's foot. The storm rattled the shutters, and the sound of the swollen creek rose against the levee. That evening, as the rain eased, Ethan cooked a thin stew from beans and salt pork, ladling it into bowls. Axel ate quickly, Rex more slowly, eyes always on the door, Milo nibbling until he could wedge himself nearer to Ethan's knee. Afterward, Ethan sat in the wooden chair near the hearth, the dogs settling on their blankets. The fire crackled, shadows stretched, and the cabin grew quiet. Then it began. Axel stirred first, his body twitching as though running in his sleep. His paws jerked, his breath hitched. A low whimper grew into a sharp cry, then into a mournful howl that split the silence. His body convulsed, legs kicking against unseen terrors. Ethan rose instantly, kneeling beside the trembling pup. "Easy," he whispered, laying a steady hand across Axel's flank. But Axel thrashed harder, his eyes still closed, trapped in the grip of nightmare. Rex whined from his corner, curling into himself, while Milo whimpered and tried to climb onto Ethan's lap. Ethan wrapped both arms around Axel, pulling the pup against his chest. "It's not real," he murmured, his voice steady despite the weight in his throat. Axel's muscles trembled under his hands, his body locked with terror. Ethan pressed his face close, speaking into the dog's ear as though sharing a secret. "You're safe. You hear me? You're safe now." Slowly Axel's trembling eased. His howl broke into ragged whimpers, then into exhausted silence. His body sagged against Ethan, head dropping heavy onto the Marine's chest. For the first time since Ethan had seen him in the market square, Axel surrendered. Ethan held him long after the nightmare had passed, his hand stroking the pup's coarse fur, the firelight flickering across both their skers, man and dog, each bearing wounds the world could not see. "Now it's my turn," Ethan whispered, his voice almost a prayer. "My turn to guard you. You're home now. You're safe." The rain of the previous night had left Riverbend swollen and restless. Mud clung to the narrow streets, and the river pressed hard against the levee, whispering its threat of flood. News, too, flowed quickly in a town this small, faster than the river, faster than reason. By the time Ethan Ward walked into town the following Sunday morning, word had already spread. He had brought 3 half-starved shepherds into his home. To some, it was foolishness. To others, it was danger. Reverend Elias Cole stood at the church steps, a tall, spare man in his late 60s, with hair like white ash and eyes that had watched over Riverbend for nearly 4 decades. His back was straight, his dark coat pressed, though his hands trembled slightly when he folded them behind his back. Life had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones, and the loss of his wife years ago had left his voice gentler, though no less firm. He was a man who believed that truth, even when spoken softly, still struck like thunder. When Ethan stopped near the churchyard to tie his boot, Reverend Cole stepped down. "I heard," Cole said, his voice low enough not to carry far. "They say you took the pups that were bagged and bound." His eyes searched Ethan's face for an answer. "I did," Ethan replied simply. Cole studied him for a long moment. "Those animals have been passed between more hands than cattle at auction. No one wanted them, Ethan. That makes them dangerous." Ethan's jaw tightened. Dangerous or abandoned? Cole sighed, rubbing a lined hand across his brow. "I've seen men try to keep such creatures before. Some succeeded, most did not. You should know, if they were sold once, they might be claimed again. And the men who sell lives don't forget profit easily." His gaze softened, but his words carried weight. "Watch the shadows. They'll come." Back at the cabin, Ethan considered the Reverend's words while working with the dogs. He had begun to train them not only in obedience, but in vigilance. Axel patrolled the gate at the edge of the property, his blue eyes alert, his steps precise. Rex learned to track scents through the marshy woods beyond the creek, his nervous energy channeled into determination once he caught a trail. Milo, though smaller and younger, stuck at Ethan's side during each exercise, his loyalty unshaken. Ethan marked his progress with quiet pride, though he said little aloud. The townsfolk, however, were less charitable. Mrs. Agnes Turner muttered to neighbors that Ward was raising wolves. Clyde Dillard shook his head whenever Ethan passed, whispering, "A man carries enough ghosts without inviting more to bite at his heels." Children dared each other to sneak close to the Ward property, only to flee when Axel's bark split the air like a warning shot. The cabin had become a point of gossip, a story told in hushed tones between market stalls. Ethan Ward, mad enough to guard his loneliness with beasts. That evening, as the sun fell behind the pines and the sky turned the color of bruised peaches, a rider appeared at the Ward gate. He was a man of medium height, shoulders hunched, his coat too fine for farm work but too worn for dignity. His hair was slicked back with oil, his mustache trimmed into sharp points that framed a mouth always poised for bargaining. He dismounted slowly, eyes darting toward the dogs. The dogs saw him first. Axel planted himself at the gate, hackles raised, teeth bared in a low growl. Rex hovered behind him, uncertain, his scarred muzzle twitching. Milo pressed close to Ethan's leg, trembling but refusing to retreat. The man held up a folded paper, the seal smeared, the writing crude. "Name's Carson," he said, voice oily, practiced. "Got business. Those dogs, they're mine." He waved the paper. "Signed, sealed. You've got no right to keep 'em." Ethan stepped forward, shotgun resting across his arm, casual but ready, his gray-green eyes fixed on Carson, unblinking. "They're not yours," he said flatly. Carson smirked, tapping the paper with one finger. "Says different right here. You don't want trouble, hand 'em over. Folks don't much like neighbors keeping dangerous animals anyhow." Ethan's grip on the shotgun tightened. Axel snarled, lunging against the gate, his blue eyes burning. Milo whimpered, pressing tighter to Ethan. The Marine's voice came low, steady, every syllable like a nailed plank. "They're not dangerous. They're not for sale. They're family." The last word struck harder than the weapon he carried. Carson's smile faltered. He glanced once more at the dogs, then at Ethan's face, and something in that unyielding stare told him there would be no bargain, no bluff to win. He tucked the paper into his coat, mounted his horse, and muttered, "You'll regret this. Nobody keeps what doesn't belong." With that, he turned and rode back into the dusk, leaving dust and threat hanging in the air. Ethan stood at the gate long after Carson vanished, the shotgun still in his hands, the dogs pressed close. Riverbend's undercurrents had shifted. Whispers had turned to warning. Reverend Cole's words rang in his mind. "Watch the shadows. They'll come." The storm that had been threatening Riverbend for days finally broke loose in the dead of night. Rain fell in sheets so heavy it erased the line between sky and earth, a gray curtain that swallowed the valley whole. The river, already swollen from weeks of spring storms, pressed harder against the levee until the old gates moaned like a wounded beast. Ethan Ward woke to the sound of water against the porch steps, the cabin trembling as if gripped by unseen hands. He threw on his boots and coat, lantern in hand, and when he stepped outside, He saw the creek had become a roaring channel, foaming and spilling into the yard. The levee had given way upriver. There was no stopping what was coming. Inside, the dog sensed it too. Axel paced restlessly, his blue eyes burning, hackles raised. Rex crouched low, whimpering at the thunder, but his body was taut, ready to move. Milo clung to Ethan's heel, trembling, his soft whine swallowed by the roar outside. Ethan's training took over. He grabbed a length of rope from the barn, looping it around his waist, and tied the other end to a support beam in the attic. "We're moving up," he said, his voice calm, the way he had spoken to men under fire. He hauled the dogs up one by one through the narrow crawlspace ladder. Axel leapt eagerly, claws scraping the wood. Rex hesitated, but Ethan steadied him with a firm hand. Milo whimpered, then clung to Ethan's chest as he climbed. The attic was cramped, the rafters creaking under the storm's assault. Ethan tore open a chest and pulled out an old canvas sack, stuffing it with jerky, a water flask, and blankets. When he tossed the bag toward the attic window, Rex, to Ethan's surprise, seized the strap in his teeth. The nervous pup pulled it toward the opening, muscles straining until the bag toppled onto the slanted roof outside. For the first time, Rex didn't shy away from responsibility. He met Ethan's eyes as if to say, "I can carry this." The water rose fast, black and swirling, pulling debris with it, logs, branches, even a half-broken wagon that slammed against the cabin's side. Ethan pushed the attic window open, and a blast of wind and rain struck them. "Axel, out!" Ethan commanded. The eldest shepherd leapt through the window, landing on the slick roof like an arrow, claws digging into the shingles. He turned back, steady and defiant against the storm. Ethan followed, Milo in his arms, Rex right behind, the sack dragging with him. The roof tilted dangerously toward the water, the current now sweeping across the yard and tearing the chicken coop from its posts. Lightning split the sky, and in that instant Ethan saw the world transformed. Houses half submerged, trees wrenched from the soil, voices crying faint and desperate across the dark. Then one voice cut through the chaos clearer than the rest. "Help! Somebody!" It was high-pitched, panicked, a child's cry. Ethan whipped his head toward the sound. Across the flood, barely visible, a boy clung to the chimney of another house, his thin body shaking, his arms wrapped so tight they looked like they might snap. Ethan recognized the face even through the storm. It was Caleb Turner, the youngest son of Clyde Dillard, the farmer who had mocked Ethan at the market, laughing at the mad Marine with his cursed dogs. Now his boy was seconds from slipping into the flood. Without hesitation, Ethan tied the rope around his waist again, securing the other end to the attic beam. "Axel!" he barked, pointing toward the opposite roof. The blue-eyed shepherd sprang forward, ears flat against the storm, muscles coiled like steel. Ethan plunged into the water after him, Milo still pressed to his chest, Rex swimming at his side with the canvas bag dragging behind. The current was fierce, cold, and unforgiving. It tore at Ethan's legs, pulling him sideways, but Axel swam like a spear, cutting through the torrent, his head high above the waves. Rex, though shivering, kicked hard, his teeth clenched around the strap. The bag floated, barely keeping its contents above water, but Rex refused to let go. Ethan gritted his teeth, the rope at his waist jerking tight as he fought the flood. Every muscle screamed, but he pressed forward, Milo's small body clinging to him with desperate faith. They reached the Turner's roof. Caleb's face was pale with terror, his eyes wide and glazed. "Don't let go!" Ethan shouted above the storm. Axel scrambled up first, claws finding purchase on the slick shingles. He braced himself beside the boy, growling at the water as though daring it to try again. Ethan hauled himself up, shoving Milo onto the roof before gripping Caleb's wrist. The boy sobbed, fingers bloodied from clutching brick. "I've got you," Ethan said firmly, dragging him onto the roof, pressing him between himself and Axel. The flood surged again, water spraying like claws against the house, but the rope held, taut and groaning. Milo pressed against Caleb's chest, licking his chin as though to quiet his sobs. Rex finally clambered up, drenched but still clutching the bag. For the first time in his young life, the timid shepherd had been fearless. Together, man and dogs guided the boy back across the water, hand over hand along the rope, fighting each surge until they reached the Ward cabin. Ethan collapsed onto the roof with Caleb in his arms, the boy crying but alive. From the higher houses along the levee, lanterns glowed. Neighbors watched, their eyes wide. They had seen it. The Marine and his 3 dogs defying the river itself. Axel stood tall, chest heaving, blue eyes fierce. Rex lay panting, the bag still between his paws. Milo pressed close to Caleb, the boy's sobs quieting beneath the pup's gentle nuzzle. In that moment, the flood had rewritten Riverbend's whispers. No longer dangerous, no longer mad. The town had seen the truth. Ethan's dogs were not burdens, but heroes. The floodwaters took days to recede, leaving behind silt, broken fences, and the sour smell of mud. Riverbend stirred slowly back to life, roofs patched with tar, chickens returned to their coops, and neighbors lending each other saws and hammers in silence born of survival. For Ethan Ward, the flood had carved more than ruin. It had carved respect. Those who once whispered behind his back now tipped their hats when he passed, some still cautious, but most with genuine gratitude. People had seen what his dogs had done, the way Axel had launched into the current without fear, the way Rex had carried the supply bag through the surge, the way Milo had steadied a child's heart with a single touch. Yet respect in Riverbend was never without challenge, and shadows, once banished, always had a way of finding new corners. On the 3rd day after the waters fell back, a notice arrived. Sheriff Grady Wilkes, a burly man with thinning hair, broad shoulders, and a temperament often torn between duty and leniency, rode out to Ethan's cabin. He was in his early 50s, his face browned by sun, his eyes tired but steady. "Ward," he said, stepping down from his bay mare, "the county clerk's office has questions. About the dogs." Ethan stiffened. "Questions?" "They've had claims filed," Wilkes replied, pulling a folded packet from his coat. "Men say the Shepherds are theirs. Papers, signatures, the whole lot. I'm no judge, Ethan, but you'll have to come to town. If it's a lie, it'll be handled, but it has to be seen." His voice carried the weight of a man who didn't want this fight, but couldn't step aside from it. The following morning, Ethan hitched the Jeep and drove into town with Axel, Rex, and Milo in the bed. The market square, still bearing the mud stains of the flood, was filled with townsfolk. Some leaned on canes, others clutched baskets, but all had gathered for the spectacle. At the center, a long table was set outside the courthouse. Behind it sat the county clerk, Mr. Dempsey, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, his thin lips pursed in constant suspicion. And before him stood the men, 3 of them, strangers to most, but not to Ethan. One was Carson, the slick-haired dealer who had once waved his forged paper at Ethan's gate. Today he wore a better coat, though it didn't hide the oiliness in his smile. Beside him stood a tall man with scarred knuckles and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low, and another heavy-set fellow whose jaw worked endlessly as he chewed a plug of tobacco. They looked like men bred for bargaining, not for care. Carson slapped a sheaf of papers on the table. "There," he announced, voice carrying, "proof these dogs belong to us. Bought fair, sold fair, and taken from us by this Marine. Law's the law." The crowd muttered. Ethan stood straight, his jaw clenched. Behind him, Axel growled low, blue eyes locked on Carson. Rex cowered slightly, but did not move. From Ethan's side, Milo sat closest, his small body pressed against Ethan's boot, as if sensing the storm ahead. Before Ethan could speak, a voice rose from the crowd. It was Sarah Calloway, the seamstress, tall and severe in her plain gray dress, her silvered hair tied in its usual tight bun. "Proof?" she said sharply, her voice slicing the murmurs. "What proof? I saw those dogs in sacks at the market, starved half to death. No man who cared for them would have let them come to that. And I saw with my own eyes when they saved Caleb Turner from the flood." Others joined. Old Hollis Dunn, bent but fierce, lifted his lantern staff. "Aye, without those dogs, half the valley would have gone under. They're no man's property, but Ward's now. He kept 'em alive. He made 'em heroes." Even Clyde Dillard, who once mocked Ethan, shifted uneasily, then spoke, his voice rough. "My boy lives because of them. That's truth enough." Carson's face reddened. He slammed a fist against the table. "They're animals," he roared. "Beasts, nothing more. You can't build families on the backs of mutts." The words snapped something in Ethan. He stepped forward, his voice rising not with fury, but with the steel edge of conviction. "You're wrong," he said, his voice carrying over the square. "They are not beasts. They are the reason Riverbend still stands. When the levee broke, when water swallowed the town, when no one else could reach, they did. Axel, Rex, Milo, they saved lives. They gave hope. You call them animals, I call them family, and no piece of paper will change that. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then a clap echoed, sharp as a rifle shot. Sarah Calloway. Another followed from Clyde. Soon the square filled with applause, hands striking, boots stomping, the sound rolling like thunder. Carson's face twisted, the other men shifted uneasily, and Sheriff Wilkes stepped forward. He picked up the papers Carson had brought, scanned them briefly, then tore them in half. The sound of the rip rang across the square, final and absolute. "These are forgeries," he declared, "and these dogs stay with Ward. That's the law." The crowd cheered. Carson spat, muttered curses, and retreated with his companions, but their eyes promised this would not be the last attempt. Yet for now, Ethan stood with his dogs in the center of Riverbend Square, the applause wrapping around him like a shield. Milo, perhaps sensing victory, tugged at his sleeve. When Ethan later returned home, he found a scrap of cardboard beneath his pillow, childishly scrawled in crooked letters. He recognized the paw smudges that had guided the pencil. The word was simple, but it cut deeper than any sermon, any applause. Home. Spring crept into Riverbend slowly, as though the earth itself were cautious after the winter storms and the flood that nearly drowned it. Shoots of green pushed through the mud where the levee had broken. Tiny trees took root in the soft black soil, and the valley that once reeked of river rot now smelled faintly of blossoms and new grass. The Ward cabin, too, seemed to breathe easier. Its porch had been mended, its windows polished, and for the first time in years, laughter, human and canine alike, spilled from its walls. Ethan Ward stood at the garden's edge with a hoe in his hand, sleeves rolled high to the elbow. The scars on his forearms caught the sun, but the work gave them new meaning. He looked over the rows of seedlings, corn just sprouting, beans winding on thin sticks, and in the center, a sapling he had planted with his dogs watching close. It leaned slightly, still fragile, but its roots clung stubbornly to the soil. Ethan pressed the earth around it with care. "You'll stand," he murmured, "like the rest of us." Behind him came the sound of padded paws. Axel trotted up first, now stronger, his sable coat shining with health, his pale blue eyes sharp and commanding. No longer just a rescued pup, Axel had grown into a natural leader, instinctively taking point whenever Ethan gave orders. He barked once, short and firm, before bounding toward the trail that led to the riverbank. Rex emerged next, tail swishing nervously, but without the constant flinch he once carried. His scarred muzzle twitched at the air as he made his rounds around the chicken coop, the birds inside clucking softly. Where once he would have hidden under the porch at a clap of thunder, now he paced with purpose. The townsfolk said Rex had become Riverbend's quiet watchman, alert to every sound the others missed. Milo, the smallest, padded out last, still carrying his pup's softness. He yawned hugely, circled twice, then plopped onto the cabin's porch step with his chin on his paws. The sun warmed his black and tan coat, and within minutes his tail twitched in sleep. Ethan smiled faintly. Milo's gift was not vigilance, but trust, the kind that reminded Ethan of the prayer he once whispered, "Let someone need me again." Word had spread through Riverbend that Ethan was no longer simply a loner with 3 strays. He had begun training them as a proper unit, using the drills he remembered from his Marine years with canine handlers. The townsfolk called them the Riverbend Canine Team, though there was no uniform, no funding, only discipline, patience, and Ethan's steady hand. Axel took the lead on search drills through the marshes. Rex guarded the property with uncanny diligence, warning of foxes, raccoons, or the occasional stranger. Milo, still learning, was the heart of the team, his loyalty grounding the others, his bark always the first to call Ethan when something was wrong. On warm afternoons, neighbors began to visit. Sarah Calloway, the seamstress who had spoken up in the square, often brought scraps of cloth and biscuits, her tall frame casting long shadows across the porch. She was a woman hardened by widowhood and softened by her devotion to the children of Riverbend, always stitching or mending, always reminding Ethan that family could be made from care, not blood. She often sat with Milo curled at her feet while she sewed, her thin hands moving with tireless grace. Even Sheriff Wilkes came by once in a while, his tired eyes brighter when he saw the dogs run drills along the fence line. He had once warned Ethan of the law's weight, But now, he admitted quietly, town sleeps easier knowing they're here. The spring wore on, and with it came a shift in the way Riverbend spoke of Ethan's cabin. No longer a place of suspicion, it had become a place where laughter returned. Children stopped at the fence to watch Axel leap over logs, to clap when Rex barked the all clear, to giggle when Milo rolled clumsily into the mud. The Ward home was no longer silent, it echoed with life. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the river, the townsfolk gathered in front of Ethan's porch. It was a simple affair. Neighbors holding lanterns, Reverend Cole at the front in his worn black coat, Sarah Calloway standing tall beside him. They had come with no grand ceremony, no official papers, only voices that carried more truth than any forged seal. Reverend Cole cleared his throat, his old voice steady. This home has stood against storms, against whispers, and against shadows. It has given shelter to the lost. It has lit the way for this valley when waters tried to take it. From this night, it will be known as the Riverbend Light. The name carried over the crowd, repeated in hushed tones, then louder, until it rolled like a hymn. Riverbend Light! Ethan stood at the porch steps, his dogs flanking him. Axel proud and steady, Rex calm but alert, Milo leaning against his leg. He swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He reached down, pulling all three against him, his arms strong enough to hold what had once been broken. He spoke not for the crowd, but for them, his voice barely above the river's murmur. Family isn't born, family is chosen, and we chose each other. The lanterns lifted in answer, their glow reflecting off the water like stars scattered upon the river. For the first time since he had left the Marines, Ethan Ward felt whole, not because he had returned to what was lost, but because he had built something new. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunder in the heavens, but small lights on the riverbank. A wounded Marine, 3 abandoned shepherds, and a town that had forgotten hope. God wove them together into a family. It reminds us that no life is too broken, no soul too lost, for grace to find and restore. In our own daily lives, we may feel like the flood is rising, or that we are carrying scars that never heal. Yet, just as Ethan and his dogs became a beacon for Riverbend, God can turn our weakness into strength, our loneliness into love, and our house into a light for others. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Type Amen in the comments if you believe God still works miracles in quiet ways. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, love, and second chances. And may the Lord bless you and your family with His protection and peace.